Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring the ancient art of monastic brewing, where medieval monks transformed simple grains into liquid sustenance through careful tradition and patient craft. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into the stone halls and steaming brew houses of monastery life, where barley becomes beer and silence mingles with the steady rhythm of sacred work. The monastery brewhouse stands apart from the main cloister buildings, positioned carefully to manage both smoke and smell. You approach the structure on a cool autumn morning when the mist still clings to the grass and the first bells have just rung for prime. The building itself rises 2 stories high, built from the same grey stone as the chapel and dormitories, but its roof shows darker staining from years of smoke and steam. Small windows dot the upper level where heat escapes, and you notice how they face away from the church, a practical consideration that keeps brewing odours from drifting towards sacred spaces. The wooden door stands propped open with a smooth river stone, and already you can hear movement inside, the scrape of wood on stone, the splash of water, the low voices of brothers beginning their day's labour. Step inside and your senses immediately register the change. The air feels warmer here, thick with moisture and layered scents that tell the story of yesterday's work and today's plans. You smell the sweet mustiness of damp grain, the sharp tang of hops, the earthy richness of yeast at work, and underneath it all, a faint smokiness from the furnace. The interior spreads before you in organised sections, each area devoted to a specific stage of the brewing process. To your left, sacks of barley lean against the wall in neat rows, their burlap surfaces slightly dusty. Straight ahead, large wooden vessels stand in careful arrangement, some sealed and silent, others open and active with fermentation. To your right, the malting floor extends across smooth flagstones, currently covered with a thin layer of sprouting grain that catches the morning light filtering through the high windows. The monks who work here move with practiced efficiency, their habits tied up at the waist to keep hems from dragging through wet grain or puddles of spilled wort. Most maintain the silence prescribed by their rule, communicating through hand signals developed over years of working together. One brother gestures toward the barley sacks and another nods, moving to begin the day's soaking. A third monk tends the furnace, adjusting the damper to maintain an even temperature, his face illuminated by the orange glow when he opens the iron door to add more wood. These men have spent years learning this craft, apprenticing under older brothers who themselves learned from the generation before, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back centuries. The brewing process begins with barley, the fundamental grain that provides both nourishment and the raw material for fermentation. Monasteries typically maintain their own barley fields or receive the grain as part of tithes and donations from local farmers. The barley arrives in large quantities during harvest season, transported in wooden carts and stored in the monastery granary until needed. Before brewing can begin, the grain undergoes careful inspection. Monks spread samples on wooden tables, running their fingers through the kernels, looking for signs of disease, insect damage, or excessive moisture. Good brewing barley feels firm and dry, with a clean smell and uniform colour. Any grain that shows mould or rot gets separated out, destined for animal feed rather than human consumption. Once approved, the barley moves to the brewhouse for malting, the first critical transformation in the brewing process. Malting serves a specific purpose that every brewer understands, but visitors often find mysterious. The grain contains starch, but yeast cannot ferment starch directly. Through malting, the starch converts to sugar, creating food the yeast can consume and transform into alcohol. This conversion happens through the grain's own natural processes, carefully controlled and then halted at precisely the right moment. Watch as the monks begin this work, moving with the calm certainty that comes from deep familiarity. The first step involves steeping, a process of controlled soaking that awakens the dormant grain. Brothers carry barley to large wooden steeping tanks, rectangular vessels that stand waist-high and hold several hundred pounds of grain. They fill these tanks with cold water, drawn from the monastery well or diverted from a nearby stream, ensuring the water level rises several inches above the grain. The barley floats at first, and monks use long wooden rakes to push down any kernels that bob on the surface, ensuring even saturation. Over the next 2 days, the grain soaks and swells, drinking in moisture until each kernel has absorbed enough water to trigger germination. Every 12 hours, workers drain the tanks and refill them with fresh water, removing waste and preventing stagnation. You can tell when the grain has steeped long enough by feel and appearance. The kernels swell noticeably, increasing in size by nearly half. When squeezed between your fingers, properly steeped barley feels firm, but yields slightly, and when broken open, the interior appears chalky white with no dry spots. After steeping comes the next phase, where the wet grain spreads across the malting floor to germinate. This broad, flat surface dominates one section of the brewhouse, constructed from smooth stone that allows air to circulate beneath, while providing a level, easy-to-clean workspace. Monks shovel the steeped barley onto this floor, spreading it in an even layer, roughly 4 to 6 inches deep. The depth matters, because grain piled too thick generates excessive heat that can damage the batch, while grain spread too thin dries out before germination completes. The brothers use wooden levelling boards to ensure consistency, dragging them across the surface until the layer achieves uniform thickness. Now begins a period of patient observation and regular labour that continues for about a week. The grain lies on the malting floor, warm and moist, and soon begins to sprout. Tiny white rootlets emerge from each kernel, followed by the acrospire, a shoot that grows inside the grain itself. Every day, monks turn the germinating barley to prevent the rootlets from tangling into an unmanageable mat, and to ensure even temperature throughout the mass. This turning happens at least twice daily, often more frequently, and requires significant effort. Workers use large wooden shovels to lift and flip the grain, exposing bottom layers to air, and redistributing heat that builds up from the germination process. Listen to the sound of this work, the rhythmic scrape and scatter of barley shifting across stone, the quiet breathing of monks engaged in physical labour, the occasional soft-spoken instruction when timing or technique needs adjustment. The germinating grain generates its own warmth, and you can feel this heat rising if you hold your hand above the malting floor. This warmth indicates that enzymatic activity has begun inside each kernel, the precise chemical changes that convert starch to sugar. Monks monitor this process carefully, checking the progress of the acrospire by cutting open sample kernels throughout the day. The ideal moment to halt germination comes when the acrospire has grown to about 3/4 the length of the grain. Stop the process too early, and insufficient enzyme development means poor sugar conversion later. Allow it to continue too long, and the growing plant consumes too much of the sugar it has created, reducing the material available for brewing. When germination reaches the optimal point, the grain moves to the kiln for drying, a process that halts growth and develops the flavours that will characterize the finished beer. The kiln occupies the upper floor of the brew house, directly above the furnace that provides heat. Its floor consists of perforated tiles or tightly woven metal screens that allow hot air to rise through while supporting the weight of the grain. Monks shovel the germinated barley, now called green malt, up a wooden staircase or haul it in baskets, spreading it across the kiln floor in a layer 6 to 8 inches deep. Below, the furnace burns steadily, fed with carefully selected fuel. Different monasteries use different materials based on local availability. Some burn hardwood, which imparts a neutral flavour. Others use peat, which creates a distinctive smoky character. The choice of fuel becomes part of each monastery's unique brewing signature. The kilning process demands constant attention and proceeds in stages. Initially, the temperature stays relatively low, around 120 degrees, allowing moisture to evaporate gradually without shocking the grain. Brothers tend the furnace, adding fuel in measured amounts to maintain steady heat. They also turn the malt on the kiln floor every few hours, using long-handled wooden rakes to redistribute the grain and ensure even drying. As moisture content drops, the temperature gradually increases, eventually reaching 150 degrees or higher for the final curing stage. This higher heat develops colour and flavour. Lightly kilned malt retains a pale golden colour and produces beers with delicate, slightly sweet flavours. More heavily kilned malt darkens to amber or brown and contributes deeper, toasted, even caramel-like notes to the finished beer. You can judge the progress of kilning through multiple senses. The malt gradually firms up as moisture departs, changing from soft and pliable to crisp and brittle. The smell evolves too, from the fresh, slightly vegetal aroma of green malt to increasingly toasted, bready scents as the Maillard reaction proceeds. Experienced brewers can estimate malt readiness by these signs alone, though most still break open sample kernels to check the interior. Properly kilned malt snaps cleanly when bent, and the interior shows no remaining moisture, appearing uniformly light or dark depending on the degree of kilning desired. After kilning completes, the finished malt cools on the kiln floor before storage. The rootlets, now dried and brittle, need removal before brewing. Monks accomplish this through a process called winnowing, which uses airflow to separate the lighter rootlets from the heavier grain. Workers shovel the malt into shallow baskets and toss it gently into the air on breezy days, allowing wind to carry away the chaff. Alternatively, they might rub the malts between their hands or roll it under wooden boards to break off the rootlets, then use sieves or screens to filter out the debris. The removed rootlets do not go to waste. Rich in protein, they become valued animal feed, distributed to the monastery livestock or sold to local farmers. The cleaned, finished malt moves to storage in the dry goods area of the brew house, where it can keep for months if protected from moisture and pests. Now the grain is ready for the next phase of transformation, the actual brewing process that will convert its sugars into beer. Let us stop here for a moment. If you are enjoying this journey through monastic brewing traditions, and you would like to see more content like this, we invite you to join our community of nighttime travelers by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. A like on this video helps us continue creating these deep dives into history. Let us know in the comments where you are settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let us continue our exploration of the monastery brew house. Brewing day begins early, often before dawn, when the monk designated as cellar unlocks the brew house and starts the furnace. The cellarer holds responsibility for all provisions in the monastery, including beer production, and typically oversees the brewing operation, even when delegating the physical work to other brothers. Today's batch will follow the pattern established over countless previous brewings, a rhythm of heating, mixing, waiting and transferring that transforms malt and water into the nourishing drink that sustains monastic life. The first task involves milling the malt to crack the kernels and expose their starchy interiors. Monasteries use various milling devices depending on their size and resources. Smaller communities might employ simple hand-turned querns, stone mills that grind grain between two circular stones. Larger, wealthier establishments maintain more sophisticated mills, powered by water wheels or horse-driven mechanisms. Regardless of the specific device, the goal remains the same: crush the malt enough to break the husks and expose the interior, but not so thoroughly that it becomes flour. The crushed malt, called grist, should contain a mix of broken kernels, loose husks, and some finer particles, a texture that allows water to flow through while extracting sugars efficiently. Watch as monks measure out the malt needed for today's batch. They use wooden scoops and buckets, counting out the required volume based on the size of their brewing vessels and the strength of beer desired. Recipes vary between monasteries and even between different batches within the same house. Some brews aim for strength and richness, using generous amounts of malt to produce the heavy, nutritious beer served during fasting periods when solid food is restricted. Others emphasize economy, stretching the malt further to produce larger quantities of lighter beer for daily consumption. The monastery might brew several grades of beer from a single malt batch, using the strongest first runnings for the abbot's table and honoured guests, the second runnings for the community of monks, and the weak third runnings for servants and labourers. The measured malt goes into the mill, and monks turn the handle or release the water to drive the mechanism, depending on the type of mill in use. The crushing stones rumble and grind, and grist flows out into waiting baskets or wooden bins. The texture gets checked frequently, with experienced brewers running the grist through their fingers to judge whether the crush is correct. Too coarse, and extraction will be poor, leaving sugars trapped in unbroken kernels. Too fine, and the resulting porridge-like consistency will cause problems during lautering, the process of separating liquid from grain. While milling proceeds, other monks prepare the mash tun, the large vessel where grist and hot water will combine to create the sweet liquid called wort. The mash tun typically consists of a substantial wooden barrel or purpose, built wooden tank, sometimes reinforced with metal bands, capable of holding anywhere from 50 to several hundred gallons depending on the monastery's production needs. Its interior must be scrupulously clean, so workers scrub it with stiff brushes and rinse it thoroughly with hot water before each use. Some brewhouses maintain multiple mash tuns, allowing different batches to proceed simultaneously or in quick succession. Water for brewing receives the same careful attention as the malt. The monastery well or spring provides water known to be pure and suitable, locations chosen partly for this reason during the monastery's founding. Monks heat large volumes of this water in the brew kettle or in separate heating vessels, bringing it to specific temperatures suited to different stages of the process. For mashing, the water needs to be hot but not boiling, typically around 150 to 160 degrees. This temperature range activates the enzymes in the malt that convert remaining starches to fermentable sugars without destroying those same enzymes through excessive heat. The mashing process begins when workers add the grist to the hot water in the mash tun, a procedure called doughing in. Monks pour or shovel the crushed malt, while others stir vigorously with long wooden paddles, ensuring the grain mixes thoroughly with the water without forming lumps. The mixture quickly thickens into a porridge-like consistency, and the temperature drops as the cooler grain absorbs heat from the water. Brewers monitor this temperature carefully, sometimes adding small amounts of additional hot or cold water to achieve their target range. Once properly mixed, the mash rests, covered with wooden boards or cloth to retain heat, while enzymatic conversion proceeds. During this rest period, which typically lasts 1 to 2 hours, the brewhouse settles into relative quiet. The mash needs no attention beyond occasional temperature checks, giving monks time to prepare other equipment, clean used vessels, or attend to other duties. Inside the mash tun, chemical transformations invisible to the eye proceed steadily. Long chains of starch molecules break down into shorter sugars. The mash gradually becomes sweeter, and the liquid takes on a golden colour. You can track this progress by drawing small samples and tasting them. Early in the mash, the liquid tastes starchy and bland. As conversion proceeds, distinct sweetness emerges and intensifies. When the mash rest completes, the process of separating liquid from grain begins, a procedure called lautering. The mash tun either has a false bottom, a perforated platform that sits above the true bottom and allows liquid to drain while holding back grain, or monks create a filter bed using some of the grain husks spread across the bottom. They open a tap at the base of the vessel, and liquid begins to flow out. Initially, this liquid appears cloudy, full of fine grain particles that escapes the filter. Brewers collect these first runnings and carefully pour them back over the top of the grain bed, recycling them through the filter until they run clear and bright. This process, called vorlauf, establishes an effective filter bed and ensures clean wort proceeds to the brew kettle. Once the wort flows clear, monks direct it into collection vessels or straight into the brew kettle. The liquid drains slowly, and brewers enhance extraction by sparging, sprinkling additional hot water over the surface of the grain bed to rinse out remaining sugars. They use special sparging devices, sometimes just a watering can with a fine rose, or more elaborate systems of perforated pipes that distribute water evenly. The grain bed must stay covered with liquid throughout this process, as exposure to air can lead to undesirable flavours and colours. Experienced brewers develop an eye for the proper sparging rate, maintaining the right balance between thorough extraction and reasonable time. The collected wort moves to the brew kettle for boiling, perhaps the most visually dramatic stage of the entire process. The brew kettle dominates one section of the brewhouse, a massive copper or iron vessel that holds the full volume of wort and sits directly over or very near the furnace. Copper kettles, prized for their excellent heat distribution and durability, gleam golden in the firelight, their surfaces polished by years of use and regular cleaning. Iron kettles, more common in less wealthy establishments, serve equally well, though they require more careful maintenance to prevent rust. The furnace roars to full intensity as monks stoke it with wood, generating the tremendous heat needed to bring hundreds of gallons of liquid to a rolling boil. You feel this heat radiating outward, warming the entire brewhouse, causing brothers to roll up their sleeves and wipe sweat from their faces as they work. The wort begins to simmer, small bubbles forming at the bottom of the kettle and rising to break at the surface. As temperature climbs, the bubbling intensifies until finally the entire volume reaches a vigorous boil, great churning masses of liquid rising and falling, steam billowing upward in thick clouds. The boiling serves multiple purposes beyond simple heat treatment. It sterilizes the wort, killing any harmful organisms that might compete with the brewer's chosen yeast. It concentrates the liquid through evaporation, increasing sugar content and intensifying flavors. It causes certain proteins to coagulate and drop out of solution, clarifying the wort. Most importantly, it provides the opportunity to add hops, the flowers that contribute bitterness, flavor, and preservative qualities to beer. Hops come from climbing vines cultivated in monastery gardens or purchased from specialized growers. The flowers, or cones, get dried and stored for year-round use, their papery green layers containing the resins and oils that brewers seek. Different monasteries use hops in different ways, following their own traditions and preferences. Some add generous amounts early in the boil, creating strongly bitter beers with excellent keeping qualities. Others add smaller quantities or add them later in the boil, preserving more delicate flavors and aromas. A few traditional recipes use alternative or additional bittering agents like herbs, gruit, or tree bark, though by the later medieval period, hop usage has become standard across most of Europe. Watch as a monk approaches the boiling kettle, carrying a basket of dried hops. He waits for a moment when the boil settles slightly, then tips the basket, pouring a measured quantity of hops into the churning wort. The hops swirl and distribute throughout the liquid, their oils and resins beginning to extract immediately. The brew house fills with their characteristic aroma, sharp and slightly floral, cutting through the sweet maltiness that previously dominated. Additional hop additions might follow at intervals throughout the boil, each contributing different qualities to the finished beer. The boil continues for at least an hour, sometimes 2 or more for stronger beers. Monks maintain the fire, monitor the intensity of the boil, and skim off the foam and protein matter that accumulates on the surface. This material, called hot break, forms a brown scum that clings to the sides of the kettle and floats in rafts on top of the wort. Regular skimming removes it before it can redissolve and contribute off flavors. The skimmed material does not go to waste, as it contains valuable protein and nutrients. The monastery kitchen might incorporate it into animal feed or spread it on the garden as fertilizer. As the boil nears completion, preparations begin for the next stage, cooling and transferring the wort to fermentation vessels. The hot wort cannot go directly to the fermenting tuns because excessive heat would kill the yeast. It must cool to roughly room temperature, ideally between 60 and 70 degrees, before yeast addition. Monasteries employ various cooling methods depending on their resources and climate. In winter, simply exposing the wort to cold air might suffice. More reliably, brewers use a cool ship, a large, shallow vessel with substantial surface area that promotes rapid heat exchange. The cool ship occupies a dedicated space in the brew house, often in an upper room with windows that can open to admit cool air. Monks transfer the finished wort from the brew kettle to the cool ship, either by bucket brigade or through wooden troughs and channels, if the brewhouse design permits gravity flow. The hot liquid spreads across the shallow pan, rarely more than 6 inches deep, maximizing contact with air. Steam rises in great quantities initially, and the room becomes hot and humid, but as hours pass, the wort gradually approaches ambient temperature. During this cooling period, the wort remains vulnerable to contamination from airborne microorganisms, though medieval brewers do not understand this in modern terms. They know from experience that wort must be protected from insects, dust, and debris, so the cool ship area stays as clean as possible, and some brew houses cover the vessel with fine cloth that allows air circulation while excluding larger contaminants. In practice, wild yeasts and bacteria inevitably find their way into the cooling wort, and some degree of wild fermentation becomes part of the monastery's characteristic beer flavour, a signature that regular drinkers would recognise immediately. Once sufficiently cooled, the wort transfers to fermentation vessels, large wooden barrels or open-topped tuns, where yeast will transform sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. These vessels receive the same scrupulous cleaning as all brewing equipment, scrubbed and rinsed to remove any residue from previous batches. Monks move the cooled wort by bucket or via wooden pipes, filling the fermentation vessels to about 3/4 capacity to allow room for the vigorous foaming that will occur during active fermentation. Now comes the moment of pitching yeast, adding the microorganisms that will perform the actual fermentation. Medieval monks do not cultivate pure yeast strains in the modern sense, but they understand that yeast is necessary and that it can be harvested from previous batches or obtained from other sources. Some monasteries maintain a mother culture, keeping a portion of yeast slurry from each batch to start the next. Others collect the thick foam that forms on top of fermenting beer, knowing it contains viable yeast. A few might rely partly on wild yeast from the environment, particularly if their brewing practices and location have established a reliable resident population. The brewer adds the yeast to the cooled wort, stirring it thoroughly to distribute the microorganisms throughout the liquid. Within hours, signs of fermentation become apparent. The wort's surface begins to show movement, small bubbles forming and rising. A thin layer of foam develops, gradually increasing in thickness and coverage. The liquid's temperature rises slightly from the metabolic heat generated by billions of yeast cells consuming sugar and reproducing. Listen to the sound of active fermentation, a gentle hissing and crackling that fills the fermenting room, punctuated by the occasional plop as large bubbles burst on the surface. Over the next several days, fermentation intensifies and then gradually subsides. During the peak period, usually the second or third day, the entire surface of the beer becomes covered with a thick, creamy foam called krausen that can rise several inches above the original liquid level. This foam has a slightly yeasty, bread-like smell, and it often shows swirling patterns as currents in the fermenting beer move it around. Monks skim off excess foam to prevent overflow and collect it for yeast banking if desired. They also monitor the fermentation temperature, as excessive heat can stress the yeast and produce off flavours. In warm weather, they might drape wet cloths over the fermenting vessels and rely on evaporative cooling to moderate temperature. The rate and character of fermentation depend on many factors, including yeast strain, temperature, wort composition, and even the season. Summer batches ferment quickly and vigorously in warm temperatures, sometimes finishing in 3 or 4 days. Winter batches proceed more slowly and gently in cool cellars, taking a week or more to complete. Experienced brewers recognize when fermentation has finished by observing the foam, which collapses and takes on a rocky, broken appearance, and by tasting the beer, which becomes noticeably less sweet as yeast consumes the available sugar. When primary fermentation completes, the young beer undergoes transfer to storage vessels for conditioning, a quieter period of maturation that smooths rough flavours and allows the beverage to clarify as remaining yeast and protein settle out. Monasteries use wooden barrels for this purpose, ranging from small casks holding 10 or 20 gallons to massive tuns capable of storing hundreds of gallons. These containers live in the monastery cellar, a cool, stable environment ideal for long-term storage. Monks transfer the beer carefully, usually by gravity, feed through wooden pipes or by gentle bucketing, trying to leave behind as much yeast sediment as possible. The beer flows into barrels that have been cleaned, inspected for leaks, and sometimes treated with burning sulfur or other traditional sanitizing methods. Once filled, the barrels are sealed with wooden bungs, though some brewers leave a small opening to allow any remaining fermentation gases to escape without building dangerous pressure. The conditioning period varies based on the type of beer and the monastery's practices. Light, weak beers intended for immediate consumption might spend only a few days in the cellar before tapping. Stronger, richer beers benefit from weeks or even months of aging, during which harsh flavors mellow, complex flavor compounds develop, and the beer gradually becomes more refined and drinkable. Throughout this period, cellar workers monitor the barrels, checking for leaks, unusual smells, or other signs of problems. The monastery produces beer not as a luxury, but as a fundamental necessity, a safe, nourishing beverage that provides calories, vitamins, and hydration when water quality remains questionable and other drinks prove expensive or unavailable. Every member of the monastic community receives a daily beer ration, typically around 2 to 3 litres, though this amount varies by season, the individual's work assignment, and whether solid food is permitted under the current liturgical rules. During Lent and other fasting periods, beer consumption often increases to compensate for reduced meals, and the monastery brews stronger, more nutritious beer specifically for these times. Beyond serving the monks themselves, the brewery produces beer for the monastery's guests, who receive hospitality as a religious duty, and for the poor, who gather at the monastery gates for daily distributions of food and drink. Some monasteries also sell beer to generate income, supporting the community's needs and charitable works. The beer's quality and reputation can bring honor to the monastery and attract pilgrims, visitors, and potential donors. The monks who work in the brewery follow a daily routine that balances brewing labor with their religious obligations. The monastic day divides into periods of prayer, work, study, and rest, with the divine office marking time through 8 services spread from midnight to evening. Brewery workers attend these services like all brothers, leaving their work to file into the chapel for psalms and prayers, then returning to resume their tasks. The work itself takes on spiritual significance, performed as an act of devotion and service. The silence traditionally observed during labour encourages meditation and prayer, and the repetitive physical nature of brewing tasks provides opportunity for contemplative practice. Training new brewers happens through apprenticeship and observation. A young monk assigned to the brewery begins with simple tasks: hauling water, stoking the furnace, cleaning vessels. Gradually, he learns more skilled work, milling malt under supervision, monitoring temperatures, judging when processes reach completion. Over years, he internalizes the craft's rhythms and develops the brewer's instinct, the ability to assess situations and make adjustments based on subtle cues of sight, smell, touch, and taste. Eventually, if he shows aptitude and dedication, he might become cellarer himself, responsible for the entire operation and for training the next generation. The brewery's annual cycle follows the agricultural seasons and the church calendar. Autumn brings harvest and intensive malting as the monastery processes the year's barley crop into malt for storage. Winter offers ideal brewing conditions with cool temperatures that produce clean fermentations and allow extended conditioning periods. Spring sees production of lighter beers suited to warmer weather, and summer requires careful management as heat challenges both fermentation control and beer stability. Throughout the year, special brews mark important feast days, welcoming distinguished visitors, or celebrating the completion of major monastery projects. Record keeping supports all this activity. Monasteries maintain careful accounts of grain received, malt produced, beer brewed and beer distributed or sold. These records serve practical purposes, helping the cellarer manage inventory and plan production, but they also reflect the medieval love of order and the monastic discipline of careful stewardship. Some brewery records survive to the present day, providing historians with detailed insights into medieval life, economy, and culture. The tools and vessels of the brewery become familiar companions to the monks who work among them. Each wooden paddle, copper kettle, and storage barrel has a history, some items passed down through generations, others newly made by monastery craftsmen or purchased from specialized artisans. The brothers maintain this equipment with care, repairing damage promptly, replacing worn parts and keeping everything scrupulously clean. A well-maintained brewery can operate for centuries, its core vessels and structures outlasting many generations of monks who work within its walls. Thank you for joining us tonight on this journey through the monastery brewery, where patient hands and ancient knowledge transform grain and water into liquid sustenance. If you enjoyed our work and are still awake, check out our other medieval content exploring the rhythms and crafts of historical life. And if you have fallen asleep, please relax and enjoy the campfire as you rest. Good night.